That was pretty fun, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a good time, and we got to sample many various types of fine whiskeys afterward.
Yeah, an important part of the puzzle. Um,
Absolutely, especially when you weren't previously versed in whiskeys, and you're not going to go out and spend, all the money on 50 bottles to line them all up and try them. So that was actually pretty nice.
yeah, they all just taste like burning to me. But
Well, and that's what I always thought, is that they all tasted bad, and that guy there actually turned me on to a couple that I thought were really nice.
yeah, an interesting group.
But I would agree that most of them I wanted to spit out, and they burned my, burned me too.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, man. So I know as we get into this research that you've done, you're going to ruffle some feathers and, you throw out some information that goes against what a lot of people in this audience probably value. But I have had several listeners request that I have you on so we can at least talk about it. And I mean, let's start out at the beginning with John Allegro and his research, because I think it's pretty compelling stuff. And you've partnered with his daughter to resurrect his book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. But give people a little bit of info about him and what he was all about.
Well, John Allegro was one of the 8 original Dead Sea Scrolls translators, a part of the original 8 team that was brought into Palestine then, or it was a little sliver of Jordan, I guess, where they had held the scrolls and began translating them. The Jordan lost that area during the Six-Day War, I believe, if I can remember all of the details off of the top of my head here. But so he worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls for years. He was the only one who published his material in a timely manner. He published his material, I think it was in 68 or 69, and none of the others published theirs until the 90s. And they had basically withheld, the others had withheld the information about the Dead Sea Scrolls and attacked other scholars, and then eventually Robert Price down at Long Beach, or not Robert Price, excuse me, Robert Eisenman down at Long Beach here in California, and then there was a doctor out of the University of Sheffield of Davies, I think was his name, and they teamed up together. And it's funny, but Eisenman, if you ask him these questions on camera, he'll scream that Allegro was wrong, and then as soon as the camera shuts off, he'll come up to you and say, "Of course Allegro was right, God damn it! Why the hell do you think they attacked him?" So don't ever ask Eisenman any of these questions on camera, but give him a drink or two and, a
little bit of whiskey.
A little bit of whiskey, and as long as he's off camera, he'll tell you everything. So, Allegro in 1970 published the book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, which was about probably the most upsetting book to society since Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And he was promptly ridiculed by not only the other members of the academic team that he worked on, but by other scholars and people all over the place. But if you get in and you look at the attacks on him, they don't ever, there was like 11 or 15 scholars that even published an attack on him in the Times literary supplement or in the Times newspaper, I forget which one. But, they never addressed his actual points. There was always just ad hominem attacks on him. And, we 12 or 11 scholars together, without addressing a single point, declare Allegro is wrong, period, slam, gavel down, right? And so, for years I was going through and validating Allegro's citations, especially his citations in regard to entheogens or psychedelics, hallucinogens. I don't, the word entheogen is a whole other story. But that ended up revealing that there was a concerted effort to cover up Allegro's work. And in regard to his book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, the attacks against him were headed by a man by the name of R. Gordon Wasson. And Wasson was a banker. He worked for J.P. Morgan Bank as the vice president of propaganda. And he is the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms. Now, Well, let me just state, from 2006 to 2008, I was writing my book, The Holy Mushroom, that went through and analyzed all of the attacks on Allegro's work and showed that all of them were false. And we went all the way down to the original primary citations, lined them all up, one after the other, so that anybody could check them and see them right there on the page. And without exception, every single attack on him was bogus. So then that forced us to turn our attention the other direction. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit more about Allegro's actual work, because he had some pretty interesting, pretty compelling thoughts on Christianity's origins and how it relates to the mushroom. I mean, I've heard a lot of interesting examples of the references and the traditions that have their roots in mushrooms, but give us a couple of those. Like, what was he really?
Well, and we need to be clear that, I've since figured out that what he discovered was not using the mushroom for true religiosity, that these cult groups essentially use the mushrooms and the drugs for inculcation of others into the cult so that they could maintain control. And so if you look at my work even 5 years ago, I hadn't figured that out yet. So I need to make that clear. If people read my book, Astrotheology and Shamanism, the history of the use is correct in that book, I would say, for the most part, but the application, how it was used, is incorrect. So, I like to, be upfront and be clear with that. Sure. Because, when you understand how these substances are actually, a better name for them would be suggestogens. They actually cause hypersuggestibility in the taker. And so, I've actually written a new paper that I haven't released yet that exposes all of this and the history of the words and how the CIA actually named them at each stage of the research that they were doing, and they could actually create those experiences in the person. But what Allegro showed was that Judeo-Christianity was based on a fertility mushroom cult, and they believed in some astrotheology and sun worship, and they believed in basically that, the sun on the ground as below, so above, the sun in the sky, the mushroom on the ground, the sun in the sky. And then there was amalgamated fertility worship in there as well, because obviously that was the source of life. And we didn't know where, mushrooms had come from at the time, et cetera, right? At the time they believed that mushrooms appeared by thunder overnight. They didn't know that spores and mycelium existed, mycelium under the ground, or mycelia, and, the microscopic spores.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who are familiar with this work, Joe Rogan talks about this a lot, and he's a proponent of psychedelics. And when
Joe talks about what aspect?
Well, the aspect that a lot of traditions in Christianity and Christmas are there as references to psychedelic mushrooms, like they grow under pine trees and they were red and white.
Sure.
And some
I should make it clear that, as soon as I published my article in 2012, Gordon Wasson, The Man, the Legend, the Myth, and I was friends with Joe Rogan for 10 years. Right. But the day I published that article, he started going all over the internet, slandering me and posting false attacks, doing radio shows attacking me and lying about the work, et cetera. And basically, all of that is just attacks on me. I mean, that's what these enlightened spiritual guys want you to believe, is that they're going around the internet and slandering and name calling at people as somehow enlightened spiritual behavior. But so I had knew Joe for years, and I had turned Joe onto all that stuff. And in fact, if people want to know the truth, I gave Joe his first dose of DMT.
Right.
And, Joe got his idea, originally I inherited in 2002, a friend of mine died that worked for KPFK Radio, where Terence had done a lot of his radio shows, and she had recorded them. And, of course, they were already recorded and out in the public, and they had been broadcast, and his books were already out there. But in 2002, I inherited this woman's Terence McKenna archives, along with a bunch of other archives that she had. And there was probably 50 to maybe 70 hours tops of Terence McKenna in these archives. And there's probably 150 hours of his lectures out there in the public these days. So it was probably like maybe a third to a half of what's out there today on the high end, right? And so I initially started out studying all of this McKenna material. I had gone through all of it. Obviously, I had to, to get it from cassettes to MP3, and I put it on my computer so that, it was WinMX and Napster back then that people would download it, from my computer from. I never did any PR. I just thought at the time, well, I'm not sure about this stuff. I'll just let people figure it out. And then as I got deeper into the research, I started writing my book, Astrotheology and Shamanism, in 2003. And the more I got into writing and researching, and of course, when you're doing research, you have to go through and verify people's citations. And just time and time again, McKenna's citations didn't check out. So that started, that really alerted me to a lot of problems in his work. I didn't suspect at all that he was an agent then at the time. I hadn't even remembered in his book True Hallucinations about his FBI chase and all of this. He's running from FBI and Interpol all over the world, and then in a lecture he later admits that they caught him and recruited him. And of course everybody wants to spin this that the mushrooms recruited him and all of this stuff. But if you get into the historical record of the mushrooms, if you go all the way back down to where we got them from, like Maria Sabina, which is the psilocybe mushrooms, the magic mushrooms that everybody takes today, those came from essentially the Mazatec Indians in Oaxaca, Mexico, and Huautla de Jimenez. And they came from a woman named Maria Sabina, who was a curandera, a healer, which is basically a witch doctor. And she was a devout Catholic. And Wasson went in there, the so-called discoverer of mushrooms, and he had a whole preconceived religion that he forced onto the Mazatec, and then told everybody that they were magic mushrooms and that this was the religious experience. But if you go in and you actually look at what Maria Sabina had to say about it, she was furious with Wasson, and she said nobody, in our society took the mushrooms for, to find God or for spiritual purposes. She says they were specifically to heal people from the sicknesses that our culture suffers from. So Wasson spun all of that into this big mystical thing, and they sold it. And when you look at the word history, in fact, of these substances, early on they were, John Smythes and Abram Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond, they create the word hallucinogen, and then people had hallucinating experiences. Then in 1957, they create the word psychotomimetic, which means psychosis mimicking. And then everybody started having psychosis mimicking experiences. Then later in and this is the same group making up these names, by the way. And then later in 1957, they make up the name psychedelic. And then everybody starts having mind manifesting experiences. And then they die in 1979, Gordon Wasson and Carl Ruck from Boston University, who was involved in all of this scandal, and Jonathan Ott. They create the name entheogen, and then everybody starts having God manifesting experiences. But when you go into the early Harvard records, there's no, and one of the MK Ultra doctors sitting there joking with Leary, and you can look this up on the internet. It's a conversation on LSD 1979. It's an old black and white video. But Oscar Yoniger is sitting there next to Leary, and he says, back in the 50s, nobody at Harvard under this guy's studies had any mystical or religious type experiences. That the whole thing was a California invention, he says. And then Leary says, wonderful, they're right. And that's because, nobody at Harvard had these experiences because, as long as it was a hallucinogen, you hallucinated. As long as it was a psychotomimetic, you had psychosis mimicking experiences. But when you grasp that this was all marketing, and then these guys were all from the Harvard Social Relations Department. Wasson was the head of propaganda for J.P. Morgan Bank. Leary was Harvard Social Relations. Leary also wrote the CIA's entrance exams. Leary was considered the #1 personality tester in the country. He was no slacky. He was the top. And he was the guy who wrote the test for the CIA. So when you get in and you understand, this agenda, then you can see that they really are suggestogens. And when Leary and Yoniger, one of the, two of the CIA's own MK Ultra doctors, are sitting there admitting that the whole thing was an invention, and Leary's bragging and laughing about it, you get that they are suggestogens and that the whole thing was marketing, was public relations.
Well,
and so then that forces us, essentially to to question the foundation of the whole psychedelic movement, of the counterculture, and of these things being sold as religions. And then when you get in, and then I'll let you go. Then when you get into the history of it, you see people like, scholars like Marlene Dobkin de Rios, who died last year. She'd been on my show before, but in her book, she admits that these substances are used for inculcating the youth into the culture, and they cause hypersuggestibility. Another MKUltra doctor, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, on the floor of Congress in 1966, says the same thing. And so, we can see this. We can, we have the history of them marketing these substances, changing their names. We know it was the exact same group of people that changed their names each time.
Yeah, man, I think that history of the development or the crafting of the terms is pretty interesting. And another part of it I've heard you talk about is the term psychedelic. When they're crafting that word, they purposely use an E instead of an O, and it is the only word that does
English
that.
language. Right. So, basically Humphrey Osmond, who is an MKUltra doctor, and he was working with Carl Rogers, involved with several MKUltra projects. He was also Aldous Huxley's personal doctor. He's the one that dosed Huxley. As far as we can tell, Huxley was one of the key architects of MKUltra. He wasn't warning people about all of this stuff. He was actually designing and orchestrating it. A lot of people think, well, he, Berkeley talk, and he was warning us. But his books and everything are actually a blueprint for how to do this stuff. He's not warning anybody. And he's, when you get into, there's a 1,000-page book, The Letters of Aldous Huxley. And when you get in and you look at that, you can actually see him recommending studies to various MKUltra researchers. He's constantly communicating with many of the MKUltra researchers like George Estabrooks, Dr. Andrea Puharich, Dr. Louis Jolyon West, and then, of course, Humphrey Osmond, Abram Hoffer, John Smithies. We know all of these guys were MKUltra. And then there is Huxley, always right on top. He's always at the lectures. He's at the Macy Conference lectures that were behind MKUltra. He's going on to secret military bases and stuff like this. So we know Huxley was one of them. But, Osmond says that some of these other words fail this criterion of uncontaminated by other associations, quote unquote. And so if the word psychodelic, obviously the first part is psycho, crazy, right?
Yeah.
And so by changing it to psychedelic, which is a totally improper formation, and no other word in the English language has that PSYCHE formation. Only psychedelic does, and only, and it was created by Osmond and Huxley. And so, we can see the agenda there, that they don't want any negative association with the experience, because what they want to do, and we can see this in Marshall McLuhan's work, that they're trying to sell it as a religious experience, and Marshall McLuhan is very clear on the whole thing. And, he has a conversation with Leary. And in fact, when you understand that all that Leary was doing that whole time was Marshall McLuhan's marketing and his own, because he was a marketing and social relations expert himself. But when you get that he was marketing this stuff, then you can gain a totally new perspective of it. And I'll read you this quote here. I'm just pulling it up from his conversation with Marshall McLuhan, and he says, and it's a little bit long here, but it's worth it, I think. He says, the lunch with Marshall McLuhan at the Plaza was informative. Drury Senate hearings and courtrooms are not the platforms for your message, Tim. You call yourself a philosopher, a reformer. Fine. But the key to your work is advertising. You're promoting a product. The new and improved accelerated brain. You must use the most current tactics for arousing customer interest. Associate LSD with all the good things that the brain can produce. Beauty, fun, philosophic wonder, religious revelation, increased intelligence, mystical romance. The problem is tricky, I said, and I being Leary. The opposition has beat us to the punch. The psychiatrists and police propagandists have already stressed the negative, which can be dangerous when the mind is re-imprinted under. Okay, re-imprinting. They're talking about re-imprinting here, okay? And so, we already know that it's not just about, getting high. They're marketing something, and McLuhan is very clear. And this is from Leary's book, Flashbacks, by the way. And he continues, they may be deliberately provoking bad trips. They never mention the 999 good experiences. They keep repeating LSD, jump out a window, then some ill-prepared person goes spinning into new realms, or he or she wonders, what happens now? Oh yeah, jump out a window. It's like the over-solicitous mother who warned her kids not to push peanuts up their noses. Exactly, agreed McLuhan. That's why your advertising must stress the religious. Find the God within. There's the origin of Enthusiasm, ladies and gentlemen. It was an advertising campaign by Marshall McLuhan.
That's interesting.
This is all frightfully interesting. Oh, there you go. Your competitors are naturally denouncing the brain as an instrument of the devil. Priceless, he says. And then to dispel fear, you must use your public image. You are the basic product endorser. Whenever you are photographed, smile, wave reassuringly, radiate courage, never complain or appear angry. It's okay if you come off as flamboyant and eccentric. You're a professor after all, but a confident attitude is the best advertisement. You must be known for your smile. And then McLuhan continues on. You're going to win the war, Timothy, eventually, but you're going to lose some major battles on the way. You're not going to overthrow the Protestant ethic in a couple of years. And so, what we see is, one, that it's an attack on religion and destroying the ethics and backbone of what makes the society. Two, we can see that they're intentionally trying to sell it as a religion and marketing it. But three, even right here, he talks about, have your rock and roll friends, write jingles about it. And then, so let's think for a minute. Who were Timothy Leary's rock and roll friends? Well, we know Rolling Stones and the Altamont concert and the murder of Meredith and all of this stuff up there. But let me throw this one past you. Picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerines, trees, and marmalade skies. Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly, a girl with kaleidoscope eyes. Cellophane flowers of yellow and green towering over your head. Look for the girl with the sun in her eyes and she's gone. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. And so, what we have here is that the Beatles got McLuhan's message to Leary and produced the song. And, of course, the Beatles were close friends with Leary. Now, in Beatles and McLuhan, and there's a book, in The Beatles and McLuhan, Understanding the Electric Age, the author Thomas McFarlane says that by 1966, the Beatles knew exactly what McLuhan meant and wanted. So they wrote the jingles like they were selling a Ford or a can of Campbell's soup or Coca-Cola. They created the jingles to sell and market LSD.
I mean, this is interesting, man. I mean, it seems like basically your mission now is to undo a lot of what you've popularized. You said you gave Joe Rogan his first DMT. He's now one of the biggest proponents of DMT. You brought out a lot of the Terence McKenna audio.
Well, the audio was already out there. Like I said, it was all stuff that he had already recorded and released. I just happened to
spread it around a little bit.
Well, I happened to inherit the master copies, and I put them in a folder with about 500 other audio files on Napster, and I just let people download them for a while, and I didn't do anything to physically popularize them. But yeah, I suppose probably the biggest mistake I made was giving Joe Rogan a hit of DMT.
So now you're trying to put the genie back in the bottle.
Well, here's the thing is, you can, I don't know if it's putting the genie back in the bottle. I had been fooled and tricked by these people myself. And
sure.
if when you go along, research is about following the citations to the conclusion. You don't, come up with your conclusion first and then force all of the citations to it. So the more I researched, the more I discovered something was wrong. When I discovered that Wasson was CIA back in 2007, 2008, I didn't realize at the time that, that all of these other guys that were involved in this were dirty as well. I just thought it was Wasson. What was up with Wasson?
And I wanted to...
But hold on. So when but when I started investigating Wasson And getting into his primary documents, I went through Yale, through Princeton, through Columbia University, all these different universities that had, letters and things from Wasson. So then I get all of these letters, and I see all these, letters, his personal letters that he's written back and forth to intelligence guys. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then, you have to think, okay, well, I can go along with the story that everybody's saying that this guy was good, or I can expose that he was a CIA agent. And then when I got into the MKUltra documents, I discovered in there that it was actually Wasson who requested the $2,000 from the Gestechter Fund, and that he is the guy who was in charge of MKUltra Subproject 58 that actually became the Life magazine article from May 13, 1957. So, I could have shut up and gone with the flow and, probably made a lot of money and been a really good agent man for him, or I could stand up and tell the truth and say, hey, this is wrong. And, at first I thought that, most of the scholars were just incompetent and, they had just based their work on secondary citations. They didn't go all the way down to the primary. But the day I released that Wasson article, the man, Gordon Wasson, the man, the legend, the myth, it's like all of a sudden, all of these people who you think are your friends are just suddenly they turn on you. They don't ever address a single point in the research. And mind you, most of them are authors, writers, and researchers. And they should be able to go point by point over the facts. But all of them avoid the topics and then start using the exact same attacks that they used on Allegro, not ever addressing anything that he published, but just attacking him. And that's exactly what Joe Rogan and Simon Powell and, all of these guys do. Graham Hancock is the latest going around doing this stuff.
Yeah. And so this is an important part of the puzzle, this Gordon Wasson's situation, how mushrooms came to be, because pretty much what you laid out, like I've looked up, and I guess the conventional view, not saying it's the right one, but for the people who are listening who might be a little confused, the conventional idea is that the CIA heard about Gordon Wasson's mushroom trips to Mexico from his article in Life magazine, and they thought these mushrooms could be useful for mind control. Yeah, well, some people think that the Gershwicker Fund was gonna just fund his trip to go get some mushrooms. So he's like, I'll do it.
Yeah, well, and that's not at all how the story went. The official version of the story, which is repeated almost exactly in all of the books post 1979, originally came from John Mark's book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, and in there, I think it's like pages 110 to 120 or something like that. It's right in that area. You can see that, it's actually Wasson that wrote the section of John Mark's book about Wasson. Now, when you get in and you actually look up who John Marks was, well, who was he? Well, he was the director of this little department called the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Oh, so he was a director of an intelligence agency. Oh, I got it. Oh, okay. And then when you look in the introduction of his book, he says that Wasson and Hoffman and James Moore assisted him with the authoring of the book. Aha. And then you see, Wasson's cameraman, Alan Richardson, admit that John Marks claims that James Moore infiltrated us, and it was James Moore who got the money. But when you actually go in and read the MKUltra documents, and you can see that every other scholar since then has lied about this, but go in and actually read the letter. It's clearly, and I have hundreds of copies of Wasson's letterheads from other letters that I pulled from these universities. It's very clear it's his letterhead. And, of course, the CIA has it blocked out, but it's very clear it's his. But if you read it, every single thing there are things that Wasson did. Wasson says, I've been on 4 prior trips to this region in search of the mushrooms, etc. James Moore hadn't been there before. The first time that James Moore went was the 1956 trip with Wasson, as far as we know and as far as all the records show. But Wasson had done trips with now I can't even think of the name. But but from 1953 to like 1963, Wasson did a trip every year. So he did 10 trips total. And James Moore was just one of them. But we can see Wasson's private letters. Like recently I published a video, Psychedelic Intelligence, where we show on screen Wasson's letters between Allen Dulles, the former head of the CIA, and talking about recruiting people to the Century Club, where Wasson and Aldous Huxley were both members, along with Dulles, and we can see, Wasson's letter requesting that money directly from the Geschichter Fund. It was not James Moore, as is the official story. Every single version of the story out there says that James Moore approached Wasson and that offered Wasson the $2,000, which back then in 1956 money, that's roughly like $17,000. So far enough to pay for the trip and the airplane and all this kind of stuff. But, so this story comes out of Mark's book and it spreads out from there. And then another thing that you can see in Wasson's letter, and it's, like I said, it's very blatantly clear. He's talking about Roger Haim there. He's talking about the team. And he says, and we're going to need the personnel that are going to be going with us. So Wasson requests the money and is talking about the team that he wants to put together under the CIA. And not only that, we have Wasson's personal letters with DCI Allen Dulles just weeks before the Life magazine article was published. We have Wasson hanging out with Dulles at the Century Club and at the Council on Foreign Relations. We have, there is another researcher, Bruce Adamson, who's a big JFK assassination researcher. And, there's in the CFR archives at Princeton University, and I've gone through and I've pulled every single citation on Wasson that Adamson had listed in his books, and every single one of them checked out. And Wasson is right there in all of these CFR conferences with all of the key people that were suspected of being involved in the Kennedy assassination. And of course, Kennedy, fired Allen Dulles, and Allen Dulles was one of the heads of the Council on Foreign, of the MKUltra program and the CIA. And Kennedy was shutting the CIA down because of the MKUltra program and all the stuff that the CIA and Dulles and Huxley were doing. And so then, he gets killed, right? And then Dulles does the investigation on his murder. Dulles was in charge of that investigation. So, right. Obviously, you couldn't get any closer. And not only that, but Huxley died on the exact same day that Kennedy was assassinated. And Huxley also recruited Leary on the same day that Kennedy was elected.
That's
and
interesting.
So, yeah, well, it's because, I think that Kennedy was really, that Huxley was really Kennedy's arch nemesis, essentially. And he's running all these things. See, Kennedy, I think, and you can find this in their comments, but, Jay Stevens in his writings talks about how the politicians wanted to uplift the masses. And then the Huxleys and everybody wanted to do a direct attack on the minds of the masses, and that they were going to use the psychedelics to do this attack rather than to uplift everyone. And so I think when Kennedy pieced it all together and he realized what the CIA was doing, he wanted to shut the CIA down. And then, when you get into the claim is that Laura Huxley dosed Aldous and he had put it in his will what he really wanted. But if you get in and you read the stuff, Laura claims, well, only I could interpret the message from his will. It was really ambiguous and only I could do it. So basically, she just made it up. But in his letters, you can see that Huxley thought he was going to be getting better. And then who did Laura call before she dosed Huxley to find out more information on it? She called none other than the CIA's own MKUltra doctor, Dr. Sidney Cohen, who was also a friend with Leary and at the party with Oscar Yoniger that people can see on that black and white video we mentioned earlier. And Leary talks in the middle of that they were all agents and they were all, in their underground cells.
Right.
And so, Laura calls Sidney Gottlieb to ask him if, he's ever dosed anybody in the process of dying. And then she goes and doses him after she talks to this MKUltra doctor, and then she claims that it was in his will. Well, why was she calling Sidney Gottlieb, asking him if it's ever been done before and all of this stuff? And then when you get that they're really suggestogens and that Kennedy was really, they were like the nemesis of each other, it's like, you couldn't even make this stuff up. So then she doses him, and essentially when you get that they're suggestogens and they cause hypersuggestibility, like if you think of the ayahuasca healers down in South America or in Mexico, et cetera, and they have all of this witchcraft that goes with it, and they might tell you something bad, and then the locals will believe it, and they'll go get that disease and die from it, right? And we see Maria Sabina treating this 17-year-old boy down in Huautla de Jimenez, and then he dies weeks later as well. So it's very possible that Laura actually suggested Huxley to his death at the same time that Kennedy died. I think that the information, the contradictions in her statements and in his letters, and then the timing with Kennedy, not only hiring Leary at the moment Kennedy was elected, but Huxley dying at that moment, and they're covering up all of Huxley's involvement with the psychedelic revolution and counterculture. It's just, you couldn't make this stuff up. You know? That's why I don't care for fiction that much, because this stuff, when you go down to the primary documents and look up what these guys were actually doing, it's way better than fiction.
So, knowing that they've been used for mind control, knowing that these psychedelics have been used to influence the culture, I mean, you yourself have done them over 1,000 times. I mean, does this information lead you to put no value on those experiences?
Well, today I think, I could probably have taken them 10 or 20 times, or maybe 100, and probably gotten as much or more out of them. And what would I have been doing in all of that time that I wasn't pillow sitting and navel gazing under their influence? I'm not going to say that I didn't gain anything out of it, but you could probably get just as much out of one or two if you do it properly, as 1,000 or hundreds or whatever you want to call it, right? Whatever number you want to put on it. But what benefit that I did get out of it was, now I can sit here with you, Greg, and talk about how it was used for control, and I've gone through the whole system, being an ethnobotanist and ethnomycologist for 20 years, having read, most of the literature out there. Now, at least I can, look at it from the other side instead of promoting it and saying, hey, and it's like being a whistleblower. You work somewhere for years or whatever, and you believe in it, and then all of a sudden one day, something goes wrong, and it wakes you up, and you go, oh, this is all wrong. And that's what happened. And what was happening with me is I was doing about 55 interviews with the world's leading psychedelic experts, and each of the interviews were being transcribed to go into this massive 1,000-page book that I never ended up publishing. It's been finished for a couple of years. But it's basically what happened was, in the process of doing all of these interviews with guys like Dave Nichols, and I mean, you name it, I interviewed just about any of them that I get my hands on, any of the top scholars from the field. And after about 2 years of doing all of these interviews, it started creating a fishbowl effect. And I could start to see that there was something else going on there that wasn't quite right. And, and then in 2009, this guy by the name of Gino Denning contacts me, and he can see, he could see a lot of the frustration I was having dealing with audience and stuff, and how they would, just attack the presenter and never the actual, information. And so he presents to me the Trivium, and I was sick at the time. He sent me the email. I couldn't get it open, and then I was getting ready to go to Peru to, visit my ex's family and to get some treatment down there, et cetera, for 15-year ongoing stomach problems. And I finally get this email open and read it, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, this is what we didn't have when we wrote ANS. This was what I kept spotting all of these sevens and the 7 liberal arts, but I couldn't figure out how it fit in. And he basically just handed it all to me, and then we did a few shows together, and then that was what really kicked it into high gear. And initially I was going to put, and it's still there, but put the Trivium and Quadrivium in with this massive book series that I did, hoping that would be enough. But then as time progressed, we began to realize that it wasn't just Wasson who was the dirty one, that most of the psychedelic stars were agents. It was, we were asking the wrong questions. It wasn't, which of these guys were agents. It was which of these guys weren't agents.
Well, let's talk about that a minute, because I really do get a lot of insight from Terence McKenna. I'm a fan of his. A lot of the audience is.
Give me an example of what insight you get from him.
Well, to paraphrase, one speech of his I really like is about the cultural operating system and shedding that, and
Right, right. So what are you really getting when you shed your culture? Now, what is the culture? The culture, it's got this root cult, but essentially what he's doing is he's selling this idea, your family and your local culture, how things are, it's just bad. You got to have this new culture, okay? Well, if your family and your extended family is what keeps you cohesive in times of trouble, if the government collapses, the money system collapses, etc., you pretty much don't care if you have that family and extended family backing behind you. But what Terence sells is feminism and humanism, that the culture is all bad, that we need to get rid of the population should only be 25% male and 75% female, and that we need to kill any extra male babies. And those are McKenna's words. He was into promoting basically Chinese communist policies on men here, and I've got quotes on that up on my site. But when we realize that culture is the backbone of society, and that the outside attackers, the elites, have to destroy that and get us, if they can create a bunch of single moms who don't have families and extended families that are then reliant upon state and social security and welfare and this kind of crap, then these single moms aren't going to retaliate. Furthermore, single moms, if you have 25% males and 75% females, well, guess what? Those females, many of those females won't have men, and they will be reliant on the state. So again, he's selling socialist policies. Now, I interviewed a couple of years ago this woman on my show, Karen Strahan, and she runs a YouTube channel called Girl Writes What, and she's done extensive research for years on feminism, and she's exposed the whole thing as a total fraud. And so, McKenna was, always promoting humanism, feminism. When you get into his ideas, though, his ideas come from a handful of people. Most of his ideas really weren't his. He quotes, Aldous Huxley a lot, who, of course, we know was a eugenicist and headed MKUltra. Alfred North Whitehead, he was a big fan of. He's into cybernetics. Cybernetics comes from the word kybernetes, which was basically government control. He's at the Esalen Institute. He's a scholar in residence there. We know for a fact that the Esalen Institute was a CIA front. He constantly cites guys like John B.S. Haldane. The world is not stranger than you suppose. It's stranger than you can suppose. Well, John B.S. Haldane was a well-known eugenicist. Okay, so again, he's taking this stuff. He cites Marshall McLuhan all the time. Marshall McLuhan was a media manipulator. But then McKenna admits that he was a propagandist. He admits that he was in propaganda for 15 years. So again, we have, Wasson, propaganda, Leary, social relations. Propaganda and social relations are sister studies. Edward Bernays created the field of public relations, and then Harvard, all of these guys had social relations. This is what McKenna was selling. So we have to look at it.
Well, let's look at the feminism thing real quick. So
right,
this
sure.
feminism thing you're saying, I mean, that's not really an aspect that I've really loved from McKenna, but I am against the aggressive warmongering male-dominated society. I can see.
Okay. Yeah. See, so when you say male-dominated society, I don't even get that. It doesn't even make sense.
All leaders. Look at all leaders of the world.
Okay, so
they're male.
Right.
Right.
All leaders of the world. I think the
historically
German prime minister right now is female. England has had female. They have a female queen. Well, it's a broad, sweeping generalization, but
throughout time,
are you going to let me talk or?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's been like 90% you, but I'm just saying.
Well,
I'm just trying to.
I thought that you were interviewing me.
Right. I'm not trying to be confrontational. I'm just trying to make my point so you can respond to it.
I know what your point is, and I've heard it. So if you let me respond, I'll respond.
Sure.
Okay. So, we are sold this, and if you actually go through the literature and go through what Karen Strahan has exposed for years now on her YouTube channel, on my show, etc., it's very much quite the opposite of that. And in fact, not only that, but lesbian couples have just as high or higher violence rates. Okay, we don't see any lesser wars in countries that are run by women. And historically, the reason why women were at home protecting is because there was a division of labor. Okay, the men went out into the evil world to deal with all of the badness and the wars and the crap going on, and they would bring supplies back to the women. Now, if it's a patriarchal, male-dominated society, men are so bad, then why are all the boys put in ditches with guns and ordered to kill each other? Why, when a ship is sinking, are the women and children saved and the men killed?
Well, the men aren't killed, but I think that's just out of respect and the desire to protect people. You know, women and children, they keep the species going on. But to get back
right, and men don't, essentially. So what you're saying is that we're disposable, and yet you're arguing that it's a male-dominated society at the same time.
Man, I'm just saying that when I look historically at world leaders, I see 95% male, and they're responsible for a lot of aggression and war and other problems.
Nurtured, raised the children. The men brought supplies back to the women. Okay, the men supplied the women with whatever they needed. Oh, honey, if you nurture me and my children, I'll give you whatever you want, honey. Oh, do you need a machine that will wash the dishes? I'll get you that. Oh, honey, do you want something that's going to bring light at nighttime? I'll get you that. Oh, honey, do you want something that makes music when there's no band around when you're busy feeding the children? I'll get you that. And so we have radio and we have dishwashers and we have all of these things because of the dedication to women. There is a different story there that feminism completely ignores and distorts as part of its agenda. And by the way, that was, more BS that came out of the Esalen Institute as well. But, for your audience that's actually interested in getting more information on this, and I do recommend they go to Karen Strahan's Girl Writes What page on YouTube and watch everything that she's got there. She's got many dozens of videos, and it's going to be very hard when people wake up to that. It was one of the hardest things because I used to believe Terence was right on feminism, and I used to argue just like you. But when you actually dump the facts and the propaganda bullshit from the propaganda masters out of Esalen, you'll see that there's a whole different story there and that they omitted all of these very key facts. And Karen, and then, there's somebody who was on Red Ice Radio last year who exposed all of this stuff as well. So I recommend your audience go out and get in and actually study that information, and you'll see that there is a lot of verifiable information that completely contradicts the official version of the story that has been sold to us as feminism.
Well, I mean, yeah, man. I mean, I'm interested. I know there's a lot of manipulation out there, and I'm interested. And I'm interested in uncovering it, man. I really am.
By the way, Gloria Steinem, who invented feminism, was a CIA agent. Just a little FYI there. I mean, how many agents can you get in a picture cycling through before you get? Oh, this was CIA.
Right.
But I'm not interested in arguing further about feminism. Your audience can look at the facts or ignore them.
That's just right, and that's just one aspect. But another thing McKenna was about was anti-materialism. Like, I'm against the mainstream, shallow, consumerist culture. I think that does exist.
Who created that? Let's get
I think the elite. I think the elite and corporations.
Okay, the elite and corporate. Okay, so where did marketing and public relations come from? It came from a man.
People who wanted to make money.
No, it came from a man by the name of Edward Bernays, who worked with Gordon Wasson, who worked with the very guys that sold us this movement. First, they get us to go out and be consumers, and then they blame us for consumerism. They marketed the consumerism to us. That was the Bernaysian, Wassonian crowd that marketed this stuff to us. And then they turn around and they blame us for being consumers and materialists.
But I think materialism goes beyond the 50s and 60s. I think it goes a lot further back than that.
Well, you had, people who were really concerned with survival and building in the 1800s and before then, marketing and public relations. I mean, if you even go and you look at a Sears catalog from the late 1800s, it talks about needs. This does this, it does this, it does that. It will serve this need. They didn't, you'll get girls and you're all, they didn't play on your fears and your propaganda. They didn't use all of these fallacies to market it to you. They told you what it did, and you either needed it and you bought it or you didn't. And it was as simple as that. Marketing didn't really come in until the understanding of public relations propaganda and how to use it really came into effect. And, we had guys like Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays, who both worked with Wasson at the Century Club and who marketed this stuff. They were all working together. These were the guys who marketed this. The problem is the elites and the Zionists and these groups, they create these problems and they market them to society. Oh, look what we can do. We can turn them all into good little consumers, and then we're going to get really rich. And then they turn around and they blame the population for the compulsory education, the dumbing down, the lack of trivium education. They turn around, they blame the people for that and say, you know what? There's too many people now. They all screwed up. They're too dumb. Now we got to get rid of them because they screwed up. It's like the.
Well, I blame the people for materialism too, to an extent. Yes, they're being manipulated, but you have a responsibility as well. Like, I'm not a super materialistic person.
Okay, and you're going the opposite extreme. I mean, there's something else too. Whereas you need to build for your future and have that family and backbone. And it's okay. I mean, obviously you don't have children, but when you do have children, you want to be able to provide a future for them, things for them, leave things for them as well. But let me just read you this quote. For if you, the rulers, suffer your people to be ill-educated and their manners to be corrupted from their infancy, and then punish them for those crimes to which their first education disposed them, what else could be concluded from this but that you first make thieves and outlaws and then punish them? Sir Thomas More, and that's from the early 16th century.
Okay.
And so, in other words, you don't dumb people down. You don't take the trivium away. You don't spend all of this effort to dumb people down. The CIA, if people were this bad, the CIA and the government and the elites wouldn't spend so much effort to hold people down and to manipulate and control them.
No doubt. No doubt we're being dumbed down.
They wouldn't force us through the compulsory education system. And then, you don't blame people. Oh, well, they should have figured it out and known they were being manipulated when they've been inculcated through this compulsory education system since the time they were 5.
Yeah, but I figured it out and you figured it out.
I figured it out. Yeah, okay, but here we're sitting here arguing over who is to blame. Do we blame the people for being PR'd and marketed by guys like Wasson and Bernays, who sold this very crap to us, and then turn around and sell us the religion? And what was Huxley selling in all of this? Oh, look, World War II happened, all of this war and all of this stuff, and it's all the men causing all of the war. Look at all of the men doing all this. Look at all the people. They're so bad. No, it was the elites. It was staged. It was eugenics. You get the boys in the ditches to kill themselves off for population control, and then you blame the masses for causing the war in the first place. The people didn't cause war. I've been all over the world. People pretty much just want to get along and take care of their families.
Agreed. The elite cause wars, and I definitely agree with you that the elite cause wars and that eugenics is part of it.
Okay, so then why the hell is Huxley and the elites and McKenna and Leary and McLuhan attacking the population and not the elites?
I mean, the population, that's a broad term. I mean, that's not everybody, but
that's
I think
the segment that was targeted was the masses of the people.
Too much materialism. I think when McKenna criticizes mainstream culture,
then you shut
let me just say a sentence, man. Let me say a sentence.
Hold on. You don't attack the population for your own propaganda.
Man, just let me say a sentence here. So if McKenna is attacking the mainstream culture and there is an alternative culture, he's anti-materialistic, and materialism leads to debt, and that is how the elite control us.
Materialism leads to debt? No.
Yes, it does. Over-materialism
No, it doesn't. What leads to debt
How could it not?
Jesus Christ, because you need a goddamn credit card and you need bankers and marketing to sell people to go buy all of this stuff. It doesn't...
But that puts you into debt. Buying credit cards put you into debt under their control.
Don't you need a banking system that's based on inflationary money and all of this shit before you can even do that?
Well, look, I don't think either one of us like the banking system here, do we?
That's irrelevant. What I'm talking about is you have precursors. You can't just blame the people. Well, they go buy things, and that's what causes debt. No, they're marketed these things. They're not taught critical thinking in the media. Then they're marketed to their emotions. Okay,
but the people have some responsibility for themselves as well. I don't think
they do. I agree with you, but they have to be able to get the proper information in the first place. You don't propagandize them like Bernays and McKenna and Leary, and then turn around and blame them
them for what they did. You uplift them, you give them the proper information, show them how it's done so that they can understand it clearly. And then, yes, you can say, they need to be responsible, but you don't hold them down and put your boot on their face while you're offering them a hand up and say, you guys are too frickin' stupid.
Right. I don't think either one of us think that that's the way things should be.
Well, that's
but
the way it's
for
going.
me, an example I learned
is you can't blame the population for what the elites have created. This is a system of social control across the board. They created the problem, and then they blame the people for their own creations. And then they'll try a new social control program, and then that one F's up, and then they blame the people. They create all of this marketing and consumerism, and then they blame the people. Look at the pollution you cause. It's bullshit. They are the ones who marketed this stuff. They are the ones who are culpable and responsible.
I mean, yeah, they are. Granted, we don't have the resources. The individuals don't have the resources.
They had plenty of resources until, what was getting the women into getting them to vote? What was that about? Let me just ask you.
Well, I know this story. Getting the women to vote, they wanted to tax them, man. I know this.
Okay, well, and it's sold for women's liberation. It was such a bad
voting is bullshit anyway,
society.
so granting someone the right to vote doesn't really do anything for me.
The whole point is to get them out of the family and into the factory and paying taxes. So that backbone of society is broken.
Right.
It's no longer
I understand. Everything that they do, everything they push is to generate more revenue. And that's why I think they push materialism on us.
But you create the consumer. You get people not reliant upon themselves, not getting stuff out of their own farms and their own ranches, etc., but buying things. And then you market to their needs once you've broken that family background. And then you don't turn around and blame them once you've done it.
Right. And I don't know how this descended into such madness, man, but I just wanted to have a conversation about, McKenna's points and was he a manipulator or wasn't he?
Obviously, he was a manipulator. Look at his background.
But it's not obvious to me or the audience. We're trying to have a conversation to make the case for that.
If you let me talk, we'll if you don't keep interrupting.
Man.
But, dude, all you want to do is defend feminism and defend McKenna because he's your hero, okay?
He's not my hero, man. He's just a guy I think has some insightful things to say.
And I asked you what insightful things, and then I showed you.
And I brought up consumerism, and you brought up feminism. And I didn't bring up feminism.
And I broke it down how this stuff, you brought up culture is what you brought up, and I showed how that was designed to break the family. I showed how feminism was designed to break the family. I showed how Bernays marketed this stuff as as an attack on the society. Bernays worked with Wasson. Bernays trained Wasson. Wasson was the head of propaganda for J.P. Morgan Bank. He's the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms. McKenna then went all over the world promoting mushrooms. McKenna was also PR. They're all out of social relations. They're all a part of this same group. It's not like, McKenna was the one superhero, really good guy. No, McKenna was dirty as hell.
Well, that's what I want to get to, the evidence that shows that he was dirty as hell. I'm interested in it. I think it's within the realm of possibility. I'm not saying that it's impossible.
Well, we have primary evidence. He admitted, number one, that he was recruited by them.
Where?
In the Esalen talk that's been posted on my website for 2 years.
Okay, but for the audience listening, make the case for them if you could.
Okay, well, you're acting like there's no evidence for any of this. So, let's look at the evidence. McKenna, in his book, True Hallucinations, talks about throughout the book how he was on the run from the FBI and Interpol. Now, in his brother's new book, after I had contacted his brother slipped in a couple of paragraphs that are 100% contradictory to Terence's own story. Of course, Terence is a primary citation. His brother would be secondary. You always go with the primary first. And so True Hallucinations, your audience can read page 22, 166, 179, 186, where he's talking about his FBI and Interpol chase. Now, at Esalen, which is a CIA MKUltra front, we have McKenna in a talk from let's see, I'm just trying to figure out what the date of the talk was. I've got it somewhere listed down here. But he says, I'm curious about one thing. What is important for you to do this? McKenna says, I wonder myself. Do you mean, am I the alien ambassador, whether I like it or not? And then he laughs and he says, well, often when asked this question, I've said it beats honest work. I mean, my brother is a PhD in 3 subjects and works in hard science, and yet I don't think it's brought him immense happiness. Not that he's despondent. But I was kind of a slider, you know. So he's right here, he's saying it beats honest work, and he's a slider. Now he says, certainly when I reached La Terrera in 1971, I had a price on my head by the FBI, and I was running out of money. I was at the end of my rope, and then they recruited me and said, you know, with a mouth like yours, there's a place for you in our organization. And I've worked in deep background positions about which the less said, the better. And then about 15 years ago, they shifted me into public relations, and I've been there to the present. That's a primary straight out admission. Now, you know, all these.
That's an interesting quote, especially towards the end. But at the beginning, I think he was being kind of
well, of course, he
sarcastic.
He's a PR guy. But if you follow the story, I just gave the page numbers from his book, True Hallucinations, about his FBI and Interpol chase. We have a very clear and concise, no contradictions flow through the story. Page 22, 166, 179, 186. And then his explanation at Esalen, which is a CIA front organization, yet again, founded by Aldous Huxley, who ran MKUltra. We have him admitting this in front of a lecture there. Now, a lot of people will say, well, it was the mushrooms that recruited him. He was talking about aliens. Well, again, like I said, when we go into the historical record, when we go all the way back to what Maria Sabina said that the mushrooms were used for, they were never used for spirituality. They had 5 uses for the mushrooms: healing, finding a lost wife, finding a missing donkey, finding someone who had gone to another country, and one other thing. Nowhere does
finding a lost wife. That's interesting.
Nowhere does it say anything about deep background, about aliens or UFOs, about public relations, or any of these things.
Sure. How would they use it to find like lost items? That's interesting.
Well, I guess to, you know, put yourself in a different place so you can think about things differently where you may have misplaced something.
Maybe. I mean, do you think that kind of alludes to the idea that mushrooms give some type of insight or unlock some type of...
Well, no, it's just, you know, it can give you a sort of third-person position where you might be able to see things from a different angle that you might not otherwise be able to see. But I would say, you know, it's as far as like, you know, if you're trying to appeal to magic there or whatever, I'm not going to follow you there.
No, I'm just talking, man. And like when McKenna says when he started that quote that you read.
Let me just read you a few quotes here.
Well, let me comment on the quote you already read real quick, and then we'll read some more quotes if that's okay.
Yeah, you know, Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock, they want everybody to believe that blatant statement about the price on his head and the FBI and deep background and public relations, that was actually the mushroom talking. So I get that.
Well, you know, at the beginning of that quote, when he says it beats honest work, and he's talking about his, I think, brother who has a honest job, I think that's the crux of what I was attracted to, because corporate work, I've done it for 10 years and it sucked. You know, that's the consumerism loop that I'm talking about, the trek that the elite have got us on, that the bankers have got us on.
So you think working for a corporation is a consumer and not being a slave to someone else? Why didn't
I think people are compelled to people are compelled to work for corporations for jobs they don't want to do with their life because they're stuck in debt.
Right. So what you're saying is that you want dishonest work rather than honest work?
I think he's being facetious when he says honest work. I think he's saying from the perspective of the masses, it's honest work, quote unquote.
Well, often when I've been asked this question, I've said it beats honest work.
Right, that's a joke.
Well,
to me,
if he is a damn propaganda guy, as he admits in the very next line, is he being honest?
That's like a joke I would make. I would say that hosting a podcast beats honest work. Like going instead of working for...
A propagandist is a paid liar. That's what a propagandist does.
But wouldn't you say, like, in a joking manner, man, in a joking manner, wouldn't you say what you do beats working at Foot Locker 40 hours a week?
I work 12 to 16 hours a day, okay?
Right, but wouldn't you say it beats having, like, a corporate job like that? Because we're independent.
But how is that, what does that have to do with honest work? You can follow your own passion and have honest work. You don't have to go be a PR guy and start lying to everybody.
No, but conventionally, honest work is like, go in and get a good job with a good corporation, a good secure job.
Or you can go get a job with a small local company owned by one of your neighbors or something, too. It doesn't have to be some big corporation. There's a lot of answers. What would you rather? Go have somebody, take a gun and point it at everybody else's head and steal their money so that you have some nice little communist system? Like, like the Soviets massacred 150 million people?
No, man, I'm anti-violent. I think McKenna preached anti-violence as well.
McKenna preached anti-violence, really?
I think.
You think? Okay, well, let me...
Did he not?
No, absolutely not. Let me read you this quote right here, because, all of this socialist crap and feminism that he promoted, feminism is based on socialism, which is essentially going and forcing other people at gunpoint to do your bidding. But this is a quote from McKenna, and this talk is Speaking the Unspeakable. And it's found in the question and answer at 1 hour and 11 minutes. And this is a summary of a long couple of paragraphs here. But he says, the mushroom said, but since you brought it up, I would be very interested in seeing a set of social policies, tax incentives, medical policies, insurance policies put in place to limit male birth. This is the way to feminize the human race. I am a feminist. As a humanist, I advocate a reduction in male birth. Now, how is that non-violent? How is that trying to not propagandize women to not raise babies? And if you read the rest of the section there, he's actually talking about women shouldn't take care of their male babies. That's not nonviolence. But
well, that I hadn't heard, and I actually think that's a solid point. That's a good point that you made. We're trying to have a conversation here, man.
And I thought you had studied some of my work, but
well, I did. I studied a good amount of it, but I missed that quote, man. That happens.
These are on the front page of the website. I've got several articles up there on McKenna. My Manufacturing the Deadhead article. We talk about how McKenna.
Well, fuck me, I guess. But I'm just.
Hold on. We talk about in the Manufacturing the Deadhead how McKenna was selling neo-feudalism and a new dark age, and how he's dumbing down the kids. Now, Jay Stevens, in the introduction of McKenna's book, states, let me just read this to you for how non-violent McKenna was in his ideas. Our appetite for simplicity has caused us to compress the chaos of the 1960s into one monolithic youth revolt. But there were two philosophies then among the revolutionaries on how the world might be remade. One path endorsed by political power and using the vantage to raise consciousness and save the world. The other path proposed an attack on the consciousness itself using a controversial and soon outlawed family of psychochemicals, the psychedelics. That is from the introduction of McKenna's The Invisible Landscape.
Yeah, man. I mean, to me, that just sounds like social commentary. He didn't really side with one way or the other.
Dude, look around you. Look at what Dave McGowan has exposed with the music. Look how society has been degraded.
Right. I don't like mainstream society.
You're missing the entire point. The whole thing wasn't about elevating us. The whole thing was to get us to stop producing and stop manufacturing and stop doing everything, so the elites could leave us behind, so that we would self-eugenicize. Okay, it's not about elevating us. If you're not reproducing, you're not elevating, you're not evolving anything. When you're dead, you're done. That's it. It's gone. They're talking about elevating them and getting rid of the masses. They're talking about an attack on consciousness itself, and that is what the entire Manufacturing the Deadhead article is about. That attack on culture and how they sold the deadhead, the hippie look, the song and dance, how they marketed the whole thing, and how Edward Bernays and Wasson were behind that.
Mm-hmm. I hear you, man. I mean, it's an interesting perspective. I'm not trying to say that I can't entertain the possibility?
Just go in and read the citations and look at the facts and put your biases and your heroes aside, and then you'll be able to understand clearly what the citations say. I'm not just making this stuff up. Every single claim that I've made in all of my work goes back to primary evidence that anyone can check. So if you put things aside and look at the evidence, it's right in front of you. The Manufacturing the Deadhead article, it's been up for 15 months. Anybody can go through and they can read how the stuff was broken down, how Huxley worked with them, how Wasson was CIA, how the Grateful Dead worked with the CIA. We've got videos of Bob Weir bragging about his hanging out with General McQuinn at the Bohemian Grove, etc.
Well, very
So there
cool,
you go.
Jan. Yeah, that pretty much does it for us, man. I find your research to be really interesting, even though it challenges a lot of my thoughts on psychedelics and counterculture.
Well, like I said, it's not about challenging your thoughts or your beliefs. It's about getting down to the facts. Put your beliefs, your thoughts, your emotions aside, put them in the jar. Dig down to the primary citations. Did Jan make this up, or did McKenna actually say this stuff? Did these guys actually do these things? Can I verify? Can I go all the way down to the primary documents that Jan has provided and check them? And if you can, and if they check out, it's true. If you can't, and nothing checks out, then I made it up. And it's as simple as that. Don't focus on me, and I keep repeating that, and it really bothers me when people try to always focus on the presenter. They want to kill the messenger, right? But, stop that behavior and just focus on the content of the message, and can you verify the information? And, if you go from that approach, you'll learn a lot more in life, and you'll go a lot further. And just name calling at people and attacking them because they challenge your beliefs doesn't make them wrong. It just makes you a name caller.
Fair point. Before we go, do you want to give the people a little info about your website or where they can continue down this rabbit hole of yours?
Sure. Well, if those who want to get into studying the trivium, they can go to triviumeducation.com. That's www.triviumeducation.com. And then the main website is gnosticmedia.com. That's GNOSTIC media.com. And of course, I'm the publisher of John Allegro's book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And you can just go to johnallegro.org.
Right on. Excellent, man. Well, it was great to meet you at ParanoiaCon. Today was fun. Sorry you got upset. I tried to be pretty respectful of our little disagreement there, but hopefully you had a good time.
I think you were the one that got upset, but anyway.
I don't know, man. I'm pretty easygoing, but
well, I just like to stick to the facts, and I don't like to go down all these emotional rabbit holes.